second lecture is about inclusive cities. I was asked to think of cities in a more holistic way. And here's just a city, but I just want to explain what we might cover in this. So we're going to just explore a little bit about what inclusive means. We're going to think a little bit about disabled people, disabled children, and then old people. So if we look at a city from any distance, we can't tell if that's inclusive or not, whether people are free to use it in the way that they might want to. And so we have to understand first what we mean by inclusive, and then go into the finer grain of the city to understand what might be happening. So, I don't know if you've ever thought about the word inclusive, and whether you have understandings or definitions of it. But part of the discussion about inclusive design at the end of the 20th century started with issues about products and environments to be used by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialised design. So the idea is that these environments and products could be used by everybody. And in America the term universal design is used. In the UK we use inclusive design, and I think we use inclusive design here, or universal. We use both. Universal design, okay. So design for all and universal design, these philosophies really have the same meaning. They're originated from design of the built environment and the use of websites, which surprised me when I first discovered that. And so were initially applied in the context of government provision. So the government provision of websites being accessible for everybody is something that our country's been driving forward, even though it forgets that there are still some people who don't have computers and don't have internet. So in the UK context, we know that there are nearly 12 million, 11.6 million people who are disabled. We know this from the census that takes place every 10 years, where people have to declare whether they're disabled. And on these censuses, we always assume people are telling the truth. So, of these, 5.7 million are people who are of working age. So that's over half. 5.1 million are over the state pension age, so old people, and 0.8 million are children. So these estimates cover the number of people with a long-standing illness, disability or infirmity, and who have significant difficulty with day-to-day activities. So these definitions are quite important. Long-standing is defined as more than a year. So if you break an arm or a leg in a cricket match, or because you get knocked down by a car or something, and it heals within a few months, that's not considered disabled, that's an illness. But longer-standing illnesses go on for more than a year. But in our country, in order to get benefits as well, financial benefits, there are other tests, and these are always very contentious. They are again at the moment. But there's something to do with, does that long-standing illness or disability mean you have difficulty with your day-to-day activities? Is it limiting what you can actually do? And here's a colleague in the green space sector who, for some years, was really helping some of our park managers to understand what inclusive parks and accessible parks might mean. So, in thinking what is an inclusive city, in the UK we have broken down those numbers into the different types of impairments that people might experience. So mobility is the largest number, and then some people have difficulty with lifting and carrying. Some people have manual dexterity. Some people have problems with continence, with their digestive system. Some people have difficulty with communicating. Some have difficulty with memory or concentration or learning. Some have difficulty recognising whether they're in danger. And there are some with physical coordination difficulties. and there are others, which we're not told what others are. And what's interesting is that a lot of people have more than one impairment. So some health conditions mean that it may affect you in more than one way. Now, there was a piece of research done that did questionnaires around schools, so specifically about children. So specifically about children, nearly 400 questionnaires. And this research was asking what sort of impairments did these particular children have. And it talked about mild learning difficulties, moderate learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, and some children having profound and multiple learning difficulties. A lot of learning difficulties, I guess, because it was in an educational context. Some of the children had autism, some had multisensory impairments, some were blind or had visual impairments, some had deaf and hearing impairments, some were emotional behavioural, and some had language difficulties. So that was interesting to see that there's a slightly different range of impairments experienced there and recorded there than in the national information. So the United Nations, we mentioned earlier, has statements that it makes, and another one that it has is the standard rules on the equalisation of opportunities for persons with disabilities. And it says that for persons with disabilities of any kind, states, that's countries, should introduce programmes of actions to make the physical environment accessible. So again, when the United Nations makes a declaration, countries, if they want to, sign up to it. And in the UK, in 1995, we had something called the UK Disability Discrimination Act, which was our response to that. There had been things going on in the country beforehand, but this was the legal response. And it says that it's unlawful to treat disabled people less favourably than non-disabled people, and that providers of services and facilities are required to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people to access services. And that reasonable adjustments to services is a really important word, but it's also what is reasonable. You know, I think sometimes we hear things on the news, and I've heard sometimes there's been people who've been disabled and not been able to get on an aeroplane because reasonable adjustments hadn't been made. And I think that defining reasonable is the sort of thing that only fully gets defined when you end up in a court of law, which is where you don't want to end up with. So what does this mean for our outdoor spaces? And what does it mean for landscape architects or others who might plan and design and manage those spaces? What I would say is that in our country, a lot of the issues to do with accessibility have actually been applied to buildings. So there are building regulations that say new buildings must have perhaps accessible thresholds, disabled toilets. In some of the schools where changes have been, where there's been amounts of money to do changes, it also means they've done ramps up to entrances and made good enough spaces where computers are, of all things. So a lot of these things get focused on the indoor environment and not very much on the outdoor environment. So while we're thinking about what this might mean for the outdoor environment, we're going to look at the models of disability, and I don't know if you know about these or not. Does anybody know? No? Okay, so there has been a tradition that for disabled people, their experience of life is described by what's called the medical model of disability, where disability is seen as something of a personal tragedy, it's a personal problem, and in need of individual treatment. And I think that's because it's happened, it's seen as a medical thing, and doctors and nurses and physiotherapists treat people. And they have been the people mainly working with and for disabled people. And I think the built environment professions perhaps haven't. But there was a change in some thinking Oh no, this also doesn't just affect the individual person. Some of it relates to the attitudes that non-disabled people have to disabled people. And so sometimes that takes the form of pitying and seeing disabled children as children in need rather than as being people in their own entity and being capable of doing things. So the change in thinking came about during the 1980s, where a whole host of disabled people were coming together and saying, this isn't what it's like. And actually the issue isn't us, the issue is society. And the social model of disability is built upon an underlying assumption that individuals have impairments, not that they're disabled, and it's society which disables people by barriers within social structures and institutions, and by policies and practices. So the practices we are putting in as built environment professionals might be not enabling people who have impairments. So from some of the research in our country, we know that in our parks, disabled people are very underrepresented as users. I think the percentage of disabled people in our country is about 10%, but it's probably a bit higher than that. I think probably people would underreport, and it's going to be getting worse as we get an increasing ageing population. But at the time of this research, 10% of the population are disabled, and only about 2 or 3% are using our parks and green spaces. So all the benefits of green spaces they're not getting. We also know from work that we did feeding into the government's Green Space Task Force that disabled children are underrepresented users of parks and playgrounds in our country. So we begin to have to unpick why this is, and we call those things barriers. So what are the barriers? And there are various pieces of research from our own country that talk about social and environmental barriers, social and institutional barriers, and technical, environmental and physical barriers. I think we might argue whether environmental and physical barriers are different, but this is how these particular people have explained this. The first authors were doing a piece of work for government, and the second were doing an independent piece of research funded by somebody else. Another piece of research done by a charity was asking what are the barriers for disabled people, and they were saying it's physical. But another really important one when people might want to go and use a park or a green space is lack of information. Do they know what there is in a park? Therefore, is it worth them even making the effort to go there? So we tended to find in the research we have done that disabled people will go to places that they're familiar with because they know what's there, they know how to get there. Sometimes they're in inadequate facilities, sometimes disabled people don't want to go by themselves, sometimes they even have difficulty going into a space. When we did the work for the government's Green Spaces Task Force, I was doing focus groups with disabled people, and I was horrified really to have one person tell me that they're wheeling themselves in a wheelchair to a park, they fell out because the footpath was in such a bad condition. So I thought that was not a good thing at all. So there are lots of issues that we don't think about well enough. We did some research. I led a team that was disabled children in primary school playgrounds, and we found very clearly there that it wasn't just the playground that was an issue, but there were social, physical and organisational obstacles to children, the disabled children being fully involved in the playground. So for instance, disabled children, some of them would have a helper, and at playtime or at lunchtime, there would be a routine imposed on that child, i.e. we will take you to the toilet, we will make sure you get your coat on, then you can go out to the playground, by which time all the other children were already out on the playground, and we clearly identified from this research that You have to be on the playground at the beginning of playtime to get involved in the games. If you're not there, you're missing the who's playing with who and what game you're playing, and really important decisions are made. And playtimes are only 15 or 20 minutes, but missing that first 5 or 7 minutes not only reduces the time you have, but reduces very important decisions and activities. So sometimes meant that the children were excluded. So those were some really big issues that we found. There were a lot of other issues. There was also some good practice, but there were definitely barriers. And then other people who've done some work since us talking about the physical barriers and policy. So if policy isn't in place, you might not get an inclusive approach. But actually, it isn't just about policy. It's about how policy is then put into practice. So that's where the organisational side comes in. There are other people who have also looked at barriers. So some people have talked about how designers don't really know how to design for disabled children because they don't know what they need. Okay? And I would argue that this is also underpinned by the fact that a lot of people don't know how to design outdoor spaces properly anyway, going back to our earlier lecture. In our country, and I don't know if it's the same here, but there's an apparent majority opinion in our country that if you're disabled, it means you're in a wheelchair, you're a wheelchair user. Whereas, as you can see from the national information and from various other pieces of research, actually there are many more impairments that people might experience and be living with. So it's clear that provision should go, for disabled children in particular, should go beyond wheelchair users. And here's a piece of work by Hewitt and Taylor. They are medical researchers, not built environment professions, who talk about we need to take into account sight, speech, hearing impairments, the need to accommodate medical support mechanisms for children with complex health needs. And this last thing is about if children might need to have drips in or tubes in, and they are in a complex wheelchair, because you get very different sorts of wheelchairs, often play spaces aren't properly accommodating those. If we sort of counter that with a little bit about what is a good outdoor playing environment, we've looked at that in the earlier lecture, but there's just a few other things here to run through. Margaret Johnson has a lovely paper in Landscape Research where she talks about Gibson's theory of affordance, that is, people will use spaces even if it's not designed for a particular activity, how those affordances are actualised and how mobility can be facilitated if those affordances are there. We also have people who talk about disabled children, and children need experience to be able to control that themselves, have graduated challenge, choice, exercise of fantasy and separation from adults. Some have talked about the need to have variety and complexity in play spaces, and then Harrington and Leismester have done work for early childhood, so nursery, kindergarten children, and talk about the 7 C's, that is character, context, connectivity, change, chance, clarity and challenge. So all of these can go up to making a good play space. And we have in our country a document called Developing Accessible Play Space. And I thought that this was a document done for government, and I thought that this was going to be about a design guide really, and it wasn't. It became guidance on the processes to getting to a design, basically. So, some very good information in that it drew on, it had a focus of involving communities and talked to disabled children, their siblings, their families in the development of the spaces, but it was very much focused on that rather than what do you do when you get to the design stage. So they held a whole range of workshops with disabled children, making those children's views the heart of the involvement with other stakeholders. So This is about the process, not the product really. And we need to understand processes as well to get into design, but I was a bit sad that it didn't actually have more design guidance in it as well. I think it was a missed opportunity really. There's another document called Inclusion by Design.